June 2, 1942. A humid night settles over Pearl Harbor, the same base still haunted by the wrecks from 7 months before. But in a windowless basement beneath a nondescript building, a different kind of battle is being fought. Inside Station Hypo, a small group of Navy cryptanalysts lean over radio intercepts, scraps of coded messages crackling through the Pacific static. Cigarette smoke coils above the humming decoding machines. Commander Joseph Rochefort, in his worn bathrobe and slippers, studies a half-decoded string of numbers and letters, fragments of Japan's secret naval code, JN-25. Hours turn to days as messages flood in. Routine logistics, fleet movements, and one repeated phrase, AF. Rochefort's team suspects it means Midway. If true, it reveals Japan's next target before the first ship even sails. To be certain, they devise a test, a silent deception played out over radio waves. The answer they receive confirms it beyond doubt. Japan is coming for Midway, and the Americans already know it. The greatest naval ambush in history has begun. Before a single plane takes off. Before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, war in the Pacific was already being fought in silence, through ciphers, intercepts, and fragments of radio static. Japan's naval codes were among the most complex in the world, a fortress of numbers and syllables designed to conceal the movements of the Imperial fleet. The most formidable of them all was JN-25, a layered cipher that encrypted every order, coordinate, and strategy into an ocean of meaningless digits. For years before the war, only a handful of Americans understood the stakes of such secrecy. At the Navy's OP-20G division in Washington, and later in outposts like Station Hypo in Hawaii and Station Cast in the Philippines, small teams of linguists and mathematicians worked tirelessly to make sense of the Japanese Navy's transmissions. These early cryptanalysts operated with little funding, even less recognition, and primitive tools. Pencil, paper, and typewriter were their weapons. Meanwhile, Japan's own system evolved with brutal efficiency. The Purple Diplomatic Code protected political messages, while JN-25 shielded military ones. Each used thousands of code groups that were routinely changed to ensure no outsider could follow their plans. The Americans knew the key to victory in any naval war would not only be ships or planes. It would be knowing where the enemy was before he struck. Then came December 7, 1941, the sky over Oahu filled with fire, and the harbor turned into a graveyard of burning steel. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military defeat, it was an intelligence catastrophe. Despite intercepting hundreds of Japanese messages in the months before, America had failed to read them in time. The cryptanalysts, blindsided and grieving, faced a truth that would haunt them. They had heard the signals, but could not yet understand their meaning. In the days that followed, the Navy's leadership realized something fundamental. The next phase of the war could not depend solely on ships or admirals. It would depend on information. Every intercepted message, every sliver of data, could mean the difference between ambush and annihilation across the Pacific. Japan advanced unchecked. The Philippines fell. Singapore surrendered, and the Allies retreated from every front. Amid this chaos, the codebreakers were told to do the impossible: break the enemy's secrets before the next blow landed. Inside a dimly lit room in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort took command of Station Hypo. A career officer with an eccentric streak, he transformed his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and radio operators into the Pacific Fleet's silent shield. They slept on cots beside their machines, drank cold coffee, and spent days sorting meaningless numbers. Every time Japan updated its codebook, months of work were erased overnight. Yet, they persisted. The warships at Midway, the carriers in the Coral Sea, the submarines in the Pacific, all their fates would hinge on whether men like Rochefort could turn static into knowledge. By early 1942, they began to notice patterns in the chaos. Certain code groups repeated: coordinates, supply orders, weather reports. Fragments of Japan's plan began to emerge from the haze. But it wasn't enough. The full meaning of JN-25 still eluded them, its heart locked behind layer upon layer of encryption. Still, Hypo's officers refused to stop. They had seen what ignorance cost. From disaster came obsession. By early 1942, the rooms of Station Hypo pulsed with the rhythm of intercepted code. Radio operators caught Japanese transmissions day and night, scribbling endless columns of 5-digit groups. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, sweat, and paper. The scent of obsession. Every click from the receiver might hold a clue, but only if someone could decipher its meaning. At the center of this effort stood Commander Joseph Rochefort, eccentric, brilliant, and defiantly unconventional. His office looked less like a naval command post and more like a mathematician's cave. Piles of decrypts covered every surface. Walls were lined with intercepted messages, and half-solved cipher tables lay scattered across desks. Rochefort and his team were no ordinary officers. They were linguists, mathematicians, and puzzle solvers, drawn together by one impossible mission: to break the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code before Japan struck again. The system they faced wasn't a simple substitution cipher. JN-25 used more than 33,000 code groups, each representing a word or phrase, which were then super-enciphered by adding random numbers from a separate additive book. It was a code within a code, a mathematical labyrinth designed to make each message unique. Even if one line was cracked, the next might be completely different. Hypo had fragments, hundreds of partial decrypts, but not enough to form complete sentences. To reconstruct Japan's intentions, they had to piece together meaning from fragments like AF or RZP. Each group might mean a base, a ship, a verb, or nothing at all. The work was relentless. They stared at numbers until they blurred, slept in their chairs, and argued over single digits that might shift an entire meaning. Yet slowly, patterns began to emerge. The Japanese used some groups repeatedly, even in their randomizations. Supply routes, weather messages, and fleet logistics began to form recognizable structures. It was like seeing a coastline emerge from fog. Still faint, but undeniable, by April 1942, Rochefort's team intercepted a series of messages, suggesting that Japan was preparing a major operation against a target identified only as AF. Washington believed AF could mean Australia or even the U.S. West Coast. But Rochefort had a different theory, that AF meant Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital base sitting between Hawaii and Japan's expanding empire. To prove it, Hypo staged one of the most brilliant intelligence deceptions in history. At Rochefort's direction, Midway's U.S. garrison sent an unencrypted radio message reporting that its freshwater system had failed. 2 days later, the Japanese sent a coded transmission that AF is short on water. The confirmation was irrefutable. AF was Midway. The U.S. Navy now knew where Japan planned to strike, and roughly when. The codebreakers had given Admiral Chester Nimitz something no fleet commander had ever possessed before: foresight. But even with partial decrypts, the picture was incomplete. Rochefort's team couldn't read every detail, only fragments: carrier striking force, invasion force, departure date. Still, it was enough. They could estimate fleet strength, timing, and even approach direction. The Japanese believed they were moving under total secrecy. In reality, their every move was being shadowed from a basement in Pearl Harbor. At first, Washington's intelligence chiefs hesitated to believe Hypo's analysis. But Nimitz trusted Rochefort and acted on his warning. U.S. carriers, still outnumbered and recovering from losses, began quietly positioning northeast of Midway. The Japanese Navy, sailing toward what it thought would be a surprise attack, was instead heading straight into an ambush. In June 1942, as Japanese planes roared into the sky, they had no idea that their movements, their plans, even their orders had already been read. The Americans weren't reacting. They were waiting. From that silent basement in Pearl Harbor, with pencils, intercepts, and sheer determination, Station Hypo had rewritten the odds of war. And in doing so, they revealed the true power of intelligence, that the greatest victories are sometimes won long before the first shot is fired. The war in the Pacific was fought across thousands of miles of ocean. But for the codebreakers of Station Hypo, the battlefield was a room without windows. Inside, time blurred. The clatter of typewriters mixed with the constant hum of decoding machines. The faint scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hung in the air. Men and women worked through the night, their eyes fixed on endless rows of numbers and symbols, knowing that a single missed detail could mean a ship lost or 1,000 men dead. Commander Joseph Rochefort rarely slept. He walked barefoot through the decoding room, wrapped in his worn bathrobe, muttering to himself as he rearranged cipher groups on the wall. Around him, his team, linguists, mathematicians, radio operators, and translators followed an almost monastic routine. Each day began with intercepted radio traffic, then sorting, comparing, cross-referencing. Theirs was a war of patience and intellect, fought in silence. Every now and then, a small breakthrough would ripple through the room. A code group matched, a phrase decoded, a pattern emerging. The momentary relief would be followed by another wave of unsolved fragments. There were no medals or parades for these victories. Their work was so secret that even their families didn't know what they did. The psychological strain was immense. The cryptanalysts lived with the constant awareness that their errors could cost lives. Unseen lives, on ships and islands thousands of miles away. Yet they also lived with a paradoxical burden. They often knew of attacks days before they happened, but were powerless to warn anyone outside approved military channels. They carried the weight of foresight, a terrible kind of knowledge. Still, their motivation remained pure, to prevent another Pearl Harbor. For many of them, that day had burned into memory. Every decrypted line of JN-25 felt like a chance to strike back. Not with guns, but with understanding. The tools of this hidden war were unlike anything found on a battlefield. Instead of rifles and shells, the codebreakers wielded IBM punch card machines, mechanical calculators, and typewriters. The data they processed wasn't explosive. It was informational, but no less lethal in consequence. Each intercepted Japanese message arrived as a stream of 5-digit groups. The U.S. Navy's OP-20G and Station Hypo turned these streams into index cards, punched holes representing each digit, then sorted and cross-referenced by machine. The process was slow and mechanical, but it allowed patterns to emerge where the human eye saw only chaos. In an age before modern computers, this was cutting-edge warfare. The Navy's cryptographic systems, from the IBM tabulators to the EIU, early bombs borrowed from British cryptanalysts, were primitive yet transformative. They allowed entire teams to test thousands of possible additive combinations, searching for matches between Japanese code groups and known operational phrases. Each breakthrough led to another layer of discovery. One codebook revealed fleet composition, another revealed logistics. Soon, Hypo began reconstructing entire Japanese order of battle documents, purely from intercepted transmissions. Meanwhile, a silent race was unfolding. Every few months, Japan updated its codes, replacing entire books of key tables. When that happened, months of work could vanish overnight. The Americans had to start again from scratch, racing to rediscover the patterns before the next offensive began. These machines weren't glamorous. They clanked, jammed, and overheated. But in those dimly lit rooms, surrounded by reels of wire and stacks of punched cards, they became weapons, extensions of human intellect, built to pierce the fog of war. In many ways, this was the birth of a new kind of warfare: information warfare. Victory no longer depended solely on who had more ships or guns, but on who could see first, know first, and predict first. The codebreakers were not alone. Intelligence, to be effective, had to be tested, and deception became their sharpest blade. The Japanese believed their radio communications were unbreakable. That illusion gave Rochefort's team the opportunity to manipulate what Japan thought it knew. The most famous example was the AF is short on water ruse, a master stroke of psychological warfare. When Hippo suspected AF referred to Midway, Rochefort needed confirmation. Rather than decode every message, he created one. Midway's garrison sent a plain text message about a broken water plant. Within days, a Japanese encrypted signal repeated the same detail. AF is short on water. That one sentence proved the next attack point, not through breaking the code alone, but through deceiving the enemy's system. This was the genius of Allied cryptanalysis. It didn't end with decryption. It extended into manipulation. Radio deception, false signals, and controlled leaks became extensions of the codebreakers' craft. Every intercepted Japanese message was not only read, it could be shaped, predicted, or used against them. The result was a new kind of warfare, invisible, cerebral, and profoundly modern. The U.S. wasn't just reacting to Japan's plans anymore, it was writing counterplans in real time, guided by signals intelligence. By the spring of 1942, these parallel efforts, the human endurance, the machine logic, and the deception tactics, had converged into one unstoppable force: foreknowledge. In Pearl Harbor's underground rooms, the U.S. Navy now possessed the rarest weapon of all: anticipation. They didn't just know what Japan would do next. They knew when and where, and the first proof of this new power would come at a place the Japanese believed untouchable: a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific. By early June 1942, Japan's plan to seize Midway was already set in motion. But what they didn't know was that every key order, every fleet movement, was being silently shadowed by American intelligence. Thanks to Rochefort's team, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew more about the Japanese Navy than Japan itself did. Through fragments of decrypted JN-25 messages, Station Hypo revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet was preparing a massive strike, targeting an objective designated AF. The decrypted phrases spoke of carriers, support ships, and landing forces, enough to invade and occupy. The Americans connected the dots. AF meant Midway, and Nimitz now possessed the single most valuable resource in warfare: foreknowledge. But intelligence is only power when acted upon. Using Hypo's information, Nimitz made a bold, almost reckless move. He sent his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to lie in wait northeast of Midway, days before the Japanese fleet even arrived. The entire U.S. naval formation, from fighter patrols to submarine screens, was positioned based on intercepted Japanese traffic. The result was a masterclass in operational intelligence. Every decision, the placement of carriers, the ambush, angles, the timing of air patrols, was informed by decoded information. When the first Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway on June 4th, the Americans were already in position. The Japanese fleet believed it was striking by surprise, but their every move had already been anticipated, mapped, and countered. It was, as one naval historian would later say, the first battle in history decided by information rather than firepower. From a tactical perspective, this was the dawn of a revolution. The lessons learned at Midway, predictive interception, signals-driven positioning, and data-informed warfare, became foundational to all modern military planning. The ocean may have been vast, but thanks to code-breaking, the WW2, this Navy fought with its eyes open. Behind the brilliance of Rochefort's team was an entire machinery of American industry, organization, and communication. Code-breaking was not just an art, it was logistics, from Pearl Harbor's station, Haipo, to Washington's OP-20G. Thousands of intercepted messages moved daily through secure teleprinters and couriers. Teams in Melbourne, Hawaii, and the Philippines coordinated in silence, each working on different parts of the same cryptographic puzzle. This network marked the birth of what we now call intelligence infrastructure, a global collaboration of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers united by a single goal: understanding the enemy's mind. In Washington, the Navy had begun integrating the new IBM tabulating systems, a precursor to digital computing, to accelerate code analysis. Messages once requiring days of manual sorting could now be cross-referenced in hours. This industrial-scale approach turned cryptography from an isolated craft into a production system. America's advantage lay not only in brilliance, but in organization. Rochefort's analysts might find patterns, but it took Washington's processing power to confirm them. The analysts in one hemisphere depended on the industrial might of the other. This fusion of intellect and infrastructure demonstrated a key wartime truth. Intelligence is only as strong as the system that supports it. The Americans had built something the Axis could not: a centralized, data-driven, cross-theater intelligence network. By combining creativity with computation, secrecy with scale, the U.S. had quietly constructed the world's first information war machine, one that could not only read messages, but act on them faster than they could be changed. War is often remembered for its admirals and generals, the men who gave orders, led fleets, or commanded armies. But at Midway, leadership was invisible. Commander Joseph Rochefort, working from a cramped basement beneath a naval hospital, never fired a shot, never saw the enemy, and never stood on a deck. Yet his influence on the outcome of the battle was as decisive as any admiral at sea. Rochefort's quiet defiance of bureaucracy defined the moral heart of this story. In Washington, senior officials doubted Haipo's conclusions. Many believed Japan would strike elsewhere, perhaps the Aleutians or even the West Coast. Rochefort stood firm, risking his career to argue that AF was Midway. He had little more than fragments and instinct. But he was right. It was a moment of leadership defined not by authority, but by conviction. Rochefort's moral courage to trust his analysis, to challenge the hierarchy, and to fight for the unseen truth became the invisible command decision that turned the tide of the Pacific War. And yet, his victory came without recognition. After Midway, politics intervened. Washington's intelligence office took credit for the success, while Rochefort's contributions were buried in classified reports. He was quietly reassigned, his achievements unacknowledged for decades. This was the paradox of the intelligence war. The greatest victories were also the most secret. Those who saved thousands of lives did so in silence, their triumphs sealed behind security clearances. But leadership takes many forms. Admiral Nimitz would later say, "The real hero of Midway was Joe Rochefort and his team." A simple statement, but one that defined the moral truth of the battle. The U.S. had learned that wars could be won not only by courage and ships, but by intellect, persistence, and quiet defiance. The convergence of these angles, human, technological, deceptive, tactical, industrial, and moral, revealed the new nature of war itself. For the first time, victory depended not only on might, but on mind. And at Midway, that realization would culminate in one of the most decisive clashes in history. A moment when foresight met firepower, and information rewrote fate. It was late May 1942. Inside the dimly lit room of Station Hypo, the air was thick with heat, cigarette smoke, and tension. For months, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts had been piecing together fragments of the Japanese naval code JN-25, chasing meaning through endless strings of numbers. One coded reference kept appearing: AF. But no one in Washington could agree on what it meant. Some believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands. Others thought it meant Fiji or Samoa. Rochefort, backed by Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, was convinced it was Midway, the tiny atoll standing alone in the center of the Pacific. Still, proof was everything. And without proof, Nimitz couldn't gamble the entire Pacific Fleet on a hunch. So Rochefort devised a simple, brilliant plan. He instructed Midway's garrison to send an unencrypted radio message, one the Japanese would certainly intercept. The message stated that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running short on drinking water. A day later, Hypo intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that AF is short on water. The room fell silent. Then came the quiet smiles. The codebreakers didn't cheer. They simply understood what it meant. They had just confirmed the target of Japan's next major offensive. That moment, quiet, technical, and almost anticlimactic, would decide the fate of the Pacific War. From that point forward, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his command team in Pearl Harbor knew what was coming, when it would come, and approximately where every Japanese carrier would be. The coordination between Rochefort, Layton, and Nimitz now moved with surgical precision. Every decrypted fragment was cross-referenced. Every movement pattern compared against intelligence from submarines and reconnaissance aircraft. Rochefort's analysts in Hawaii worked around the clock, their decoding machines humming constantly. They identified the size of the Japanese strike force: 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and transports. It was Yamamoto's full might, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. But now, the roles were reversed. This time, the Americans knew exactly where their enemy would be, and the Japanese had no idea they were walking into an ambush. In Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence was still hesitant. Many doubted Hypo's confidence, but Nimitz trusted his men in the field more than the bureaucrats in D.C. He made his decision. He would commit the entire U.S. carrier force to intercept the Japanese before they reached Midway. By the end of May, Task Force 16, under Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey and later Raymond Spruance, due to Halsey's illness, and Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, were already moving into position northeast of Midway. The trap was being set, invisibly, patiently. Every American movement, from carrier headings to patrol flight paths, was dictated by signals intelligence. Nimitz even timed the carrier's approach so they would be hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The plan relied not on luck, but on mathematical precision, the science of timing. Rochefort's decrypts predicted that the Japanese strike would arrive on June 4, 1942. That gave Nimitz exactly 1 week to position his ships. On the map in his operations room at Pearl Harbor, pins marked the locations of the U.S. carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Opposite them, another set of pins represented the Japanese. Kido Butai, their elite carrier striking force. Except the Japanese didn't know that. Their every move had already been mapped. Rochefort's, Men continued decrypting right up until the day before the battle. One final intercept confirmed the Japanese plan to attack Midway's airfields first, then destroy the U.S. fleet when it came to the island's defense. Exactly as they had done at Pearl Harbor. But this time, America would be waiting. As Japanese carriers steamed eastward across the Pacific, the signals from their fleet remained steady and unencrypted enough to track direction and timing. Hypo could not read every message in full, but they could predict the tempo of operations, launch windows, communication intervals, and even estimated carrier coordinates. It was, in essence, a map drawn from invisible ink. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz and Leighton finalized their trap. The plan was audacious. They would hide their own carriers far northeast of Midway, completely undetected, while Midway's air forces, a mix of marine dive bombers, B-17s, and torpedo planes, would act as bait. When the Japanese struck the island, thinking the American carriers were still days away, Spruance and Fletcher would attack from the flank. Everything depended on timing, and timing depended on code breaking. By June 2nd, the ocean was empty. By June 3rd, the first American patrol planes from Midway began reporting contacts, distant radar blips, long-range sightings of Japanese transports. The signals matched perfectly with Rochefort's predictions. Every line of code, every intercepted frequency, every sleepless night spent decoding. It all pointed to this. The enemy was exactly where they were supposed to be. And yet, Japan had no idea they were being watched. The brilliance of their own operational security, the discipline of their radio silence, all of it had been undone by a few men in a basement who had learned how to read between the numbers. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, Yamamoto's massive fleet approached Midway Atoll, confident, unopposed, and entirely unaware. The sky was clear. The sea was calm. The wind carried the scent of salt and aviation fuel. On Japanese bridges, officers prepared for what they believed would be another flawless victory. But 200 miles to the northeast, hidden by distance and radio silence, the three U.S. carriers waited in perfect position. Engines idled. Flight crews stood ready. Their commanders already knew where the enemy would be, within hours. Japan was sailing blind into the trap. June 4th, 1942, 04:30 hours. The first Japanese aircraft took off from the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their target, Midway Atoll. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's battle plan mirrored the success of Pearl Harbor. Strike first, destroy airfields, draw the enemy into the open, then annihilate the American fleet. But this time, every move Japan made was already known. From the command room at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received updates in near real time. Reconnaissance planes had spotted the Japanese advance exactly where Rochefort's decrypts had predicted. The Americans were not reacting. They were waiting. At Midway, Marine and Army Air Force squadrons scrambled into the sky. The defenders knew they were outnumbered, but their mission was simple: buy time. As bombs rained down on the atoll, American aircraft dove headlong into the Japanese formation. They were slaughtered, nearly wiped out, but their sacrifice forced Japan to delay its second strike. That delay changed everything, because at that same moment, to the northeast of Midway, U.S. carrier decks roared to life. On USS Enterprise, dive bomber pilots tightened their harnesses. Engines screamed against the morning wind. Orders came through from Admiral Raymond Spruance. Launch everything we have. At 0700 hours, squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown lifted into the sky. The Americans didn't know precisely where the Japanese carriers were, but Rochefort's team had given them coordinates close enough to find them. The sea stretched endlessly below. Pilots searched for hours, burning fuel, relying on instinct and partial reports. Then, at 0920 hours, luck, or perhaps precision, struck. A U.S. scout plane sighted the Japanese fleet. Coordinates flashed back to the carriers. Moments later, the American strike groups adjusted course. They had found their target. At 10:20 hours, after waves of torpedo bombers had been massacred by Japanese fighters, a group of dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived almost simultaneously, by sheer timing, over the Japanese carriers. Below them, the decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crowded with refueling aircraft and bombs. The Japanese were preparing their second strike against Midway. Then the sky split open. Dive bombers plunged from 20,000 feet. The first hit Kaga. The next struck Akagi's flight deck. Moments later, Soryu was engulfed in flames. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers were burning. The heart of the Kido Butai, the same force that had humiliated America at Pearl Harbor. Japanese crews fought to contain the inferno, but aviation fuel and munitions turned the ships into fireballs. Men were thrown into the sea. Others burned alive on the decks. Admiral Chuichi Nagamo, watching from a distance, could only stare in disbelief. His meticulously planned ambush had collapsed. Destroyed by intelligence he didn't even know existed. But the fight wasn't over yet. From the surviving carrier Hiryu, Japan launched one desperate counterstrike. Its bombers found Yorktown, scoring 2 direct hits that left the American carrier dead in the water. For a moment, it seemed the tide might shift again. But later that afternoon, American scouts spotted Hiryu. Another strike group, this time from Enterprise, dove out of the sun and sent Hiryu to the bottom. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were lost. The Imperial Navy, once the most feared fleet in the Pacific, had been shattered in a single day. When the sun dipped below the Pacific horizon, the Battle of Midway was over. On the decks of the U.S. carriers, exhausted pilots staggered back to their bunks. Many never returned from the day's sorties. The ocean still burned with oil and wreckage. Admiral Nimitz, upon hearing the final reports, said quietly, "God bless those boys. They've changed the course of the war." But in truth, it had been changed before the battle ever began. In a windowless basement where cryptanalysts, linguists, and engineers had turned raw intellect into a weapon. The victory at Midway was not just won by torpedoes and dive bombers. It was won by the invisible war of codebreakers who saw what no one else could. The Japanese fleet sailed into a battle they believed they controlled. Instead, they were walking through a script already written by men they had never met. In 6 months, America had gone from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor to the triumph of Midway. 4 carriers lost, thousands of Japan's best sailors dead. The momentum of the Pacific War had shifted forever. The empire would never again go on the offensive. From that day on, the Pacific belonged to those who could see first, those who could listen, to the silence between signals. The war of machines had become a war of minds, the intelligence. Triumph at Midway marked a new era. Warfare driven by information, deception, and foresight. But it was also a turning point for the men who fought it. Soldiers and scientists alike, realizing that battles could be won long before the first shot was fired. The Cold War had rewritten how nations fought, and its echoes would shape every war to come. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific, one truth became immediately clear. Japan's naval dominance was gone. In a single day, 4 of its frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed, along with hundreds of aircraft and some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. For years, Those 4 ships had been the beating heart of the Imperial Navy's offensive power. They had struck at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon, projecting Japanese might across 2 oceans. Now, they lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The loss could never be undone. Japan had neither the industrial capacity nor the trained air crews to replace them. From a purely operational standpoint, Midway reset the Pacific chessboard. Until June 1942, Japan had dictated the tempo, launching offensives in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Solomons. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, had been on the defensive. But after Midway, that dynamic flipped almost overnight. With Japan's carrier arm crippled, Admiral Chester Nimitz could now think beyond defense. Plans that had once seemed distant, the counter-offensive through the Solomon Islands and eventually toward Japan itself, suddenly became possible. In August 1942, just 2 months later, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the long island-hopping campaign that would take them all the way to Tokyo Bay. Without Midway, there would have been no Guadalcanal, no sustained Pacific offensive. The dominoes had started to fall. Intelligence, once a background activity, became the center of strategy. The success of Station Haipo and its intercepts proved that information could destroy fleets as effectively as bombs or torpedoes. Satri, U.S. Navy expanded its code-breaking infrastructure, refining its SIGINT, signals intelligence, capabilities across the Pacific. Intercept stations were built from Hawaii to Australia, forming a vast network feeding decoded Japanese communications to frontline commanders. Every major battle that followed, from the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to Leyte Gulf, was influenced by that intelligence network. By 1943, U.S. forces could anticipate Japanese moves days in advance. Convoy routes were altered, ambushes were avoided, and enemy fleets were intercepted before they could strike. The war had become a contest of foresight. For Japan, the operational consequences were devastating. The loss of 4 carriers shattered not only its naval power, but also its morale. The pilots lost at Midway were the product of years of elite training, men who had once believed themselves invincible. They could not be replaced. Japan's naval air arm, once the envy of the world, entered a slow decline. Replacement pilots received minimal training. Aircraft quality fell behind U.S. designs. Meanwhile, the United States was producing carriers, aircraft, and pilots at an exponential rate. By 1944, America had more than 100 aircraft carriers, from fleet carriers to escort types, while Japan struggled to keep a handful operational. The Battle of Midway had tilted the scales irreversibly. Operationally, Midway was also a study in the power of coordination. The fusion of intelligence, command, and tactics, from Rochefort's intercepts to Nimitz's decision-making, demonstrated how a decentralized but data-driven system could outperform centralized, rigid command structures. The Japanese plan, though ambitious, depended on secrecy and precision. Once its secrecy was lost, the entire structure unraveled. That lesson would echo through every Allied campaign afterward. Control information, and you control the battlefield. In numbers, the transformation was staggering. From late 1942 onward, U.S. losses at sea began to decline sharply. Japanese merchant shipping losses skyrocketed, strangling their industrial lifeline, American. Aircraft and submarines operated with near total intelligence support. By 1944, U.S. cryptanalysts were not only reading Japanese fleet codes, but also tracking troop movements, supply chains, and radio transmissions across the empire. Every intercepted message tightened the noose. The operational revolution triggered by Midway would shape Allied conduct until the war's end, and long beyond it. But the true impact went deeper. It was not only about tactics or logistics. It was about people, the ones who made the invisible war possible. Those who worked in silence, in dimly lit rooms filled with static and typewriters. The men and women who proved that wars could be won not only by courage or steel, but by intellect. And their story didn't end with victory at Midway. It was only beginning. The Battle of Midway was over, but its echoes reshaped the entire architecture of modern intelligence and warfare. When the Japanese fleet sank beneath the Pacific, it wasn't just ships that disappeared, it was an era. The age of pure military might give way to a new one, where information itself became a weapon. In Washington, the quiet heroes of Midway found themselves pushed aside by politics. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose team at Station Haipo had cracked Japan's JN-25 code and enabled the victory, was not celebrated. Instead, bureaucratic rivalries in Washington, particularly within OP-20G, the Navy's communications branch, led to Rochefort's removal. He was reassigned to an irrelevant shipyard post, denied official credit, and left in silence while others claimed the glory. It would take nearly 40 years for the U.S. Navy to officially recognize his role. In 1986, long after his death, Rochefort was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. For him, the victory at Midway came at a personal cost, the price of being right too soon. Strategically, the lessons of Midway redefined intelligence forever. The fusion of signals, decryption, and operations became a permanent doctrine, not an experiment. When the war ended, the Allied nations institutionalized what they had learned. The infrastructure that began with Station Haipo and Bletchley Park evolved into the global intelligence networks of the Cold War. The NSA, the CIA, and the GCHQ in Britain. Midway's legacy wasn't just about decoding ciphers, it was about decoding entire nations. The war had proven that the most decisive victories could come before a single shot was fired. And as new global tensions rose, intelligence would no longer be a tool of war. It would become the battlefield. Yet for all its brilliance, Midway's success revealed a haunting paradox. The intellect that saved lives could also end them. Only 3 years after Rochefort's triumph, another secret American project would reach its culmination. The Manhattan Project, where scientists used similar analytical precision to split the atom and end the war in a blinding flash. The same logic, that knowledge could win wars faster than bullets, had led humanity to its most powerful and terrifying creation. The victory at Midway had proven the mind's supremacy in warfare. Hiroshima proved its peril. The men who lived in that world of secrecy felt its weight deeply. Many cryptanalysts, engineers, and scientists who had worked in anonymity began to question what their genius had unleashed. Leo Szilard, one of the physicists behind the atomic bomb, tried to halt its use with a petition to President Truman. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who led Los Alamos, would later quote the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In the space of a few years, intellect had won wars and burdened humanity with the fear of extinction. That was the dual legacy of the scientific and intelligence revolutions of World War II, progress entwined with peril. But amid the moral shadows, there was also light. The same disciplines that broke codes would evolve into modern computing, communications security, and medical technologies that would save millions in the post-war decades. The legacy of Midway's cryptanalysts extended far beyond battle, to a new digital world where machines would process data, protect secrets, and connect continents. What began as intercepted radio chatter would become the foundation of the information age. The human and strategic consequences of Midway intertwined in a single truth. The war proved that intellect could alter destiny. Rochefort's tiny, windowless room in Pearl Harbor had quietly shifted the balance of world power. And though few remembered his name, his work echoed in every intelligence briefing, every digital encryption, every silent struggle fought not with guns, but with information. In war, victory is often measured in explosions, in the roar of engines, the flash of gunfire, the thunder of bombs. But sometimes, the most decisive victories happen in silence. The Battle of Midway was one of those. Long before the carriers launched, before the pilots climbed into their cockpits, the true battle had already been fought and won in a small, windowless room in Pearl Harbor. There were no medals for the hum of decoding machines, no parades for the men and women who sifted through endless streams of meaningless numbers, searching for a pattern, a clue, a whisper of the enemy's plan. Yet it was their quiet intellect, not brute force, that turned the tide of the Pacific War. Theirs was an invisible war, one fought not with torpedoes or shells, but with logic, patience, and imagination. And in that invisibility lies the paradox of modern warfare. The more intelligent it becomes, the less visible it is. Each cipher cracked, each transmission intercepted, each false message sent. These were strokes of genius that changed the course of nations. But no one saw them. They were victories written in silence, buried in secrecy, and revealed only decades later when the world was finally ready to understand how close it had come to a different fate. From Station Hypo's narrow rooms to the global intelligence networks that followed, Midway marked the moment when knowledge became the new form of power. And when the mind, not the sword, became humanity's sharpest weapon. And yet, that triumph carried a quiet warning. Once intellect learns to shape war, it can never unlearn it. The same brilliance that cracked JN-25 would one day split the atom. The same secrecy that saved a fleet would build an age of hidden empires and invisible eyes. In the end, the lesson of Midway is timeless. Wars may be fought by armies, but they are won by understanding. The battle for Midway wasn't fought when the planes took off. It was already over, in the quiet hum of a code room,